This is a joint program between ASPI, Asia Society Policy Institute of the Global Asia Society, and the Hong Kong Center of the Asia Society. This is probably the first program that I appear before all of you, not as the co-chair of the Asia Society, for which I'm delighted. And the reason is because we have been able to find much more qualified individuals to fill the role. As you know, my co-chair, Henrietta Fore, is now the head of UNICEF in the United Nations in New York City. So we lost the good one, and you got rid of the bad one, and we have found two very, very capable, most able co-chairs. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Asia Society has gone much higher since the last time you saw me here. I'm happy to introduce to you our two co-chairs, my longtime friend John Thornton, whom I met 20-some years ago in Sweden. Since then, we've become good friends. And then Ambassador Chen Hengqi, the long-serving Singaporean ambassador to China, to the United States, I'm sorry. So, ladies and gentlemen, can you welcome, take a bow, John Hengqi. Let Hong Kong members know you. I'm also delighted to have the Consul General from America, Kurt Tong, and the Consul General from Mexico here. Great to have you both. The Asia Society has decided long ago that we should meet twice a year, once in New York City and once in Hong Kong. As my predecessor, Richard Holbrooke, told me some 15 years ago, Hong Kong should be the other headquarters of the Asia Society, and I thought Richard was crazy. It turned out that he's not crazy, he's just foresighted. And we're delighted that now we have a wonderful center here in Hong Kong, and the board meets once there and once here. I just also want to mention, can I just invite all the trustees, the global trustee of the Asia Society to rise to be recognized. Ladies and gentlemen, the trustees of the Global Asia Society. I would not single any one of them out except four. Three are the co-chairs of the Asia Society, Betsy, Lulu, and Luke Caden. And then we also have the newest. I'm very, very proud of this. You know, some of you know that I have a hand in the establishment of our Korea Center, of our India Center, and I'm very, very happy that we also now, under the capable leadership of our President, Josette Sheeran, extended our coverage all the way to the Middle East, and we have our first trustee from Saudi Arabia, Prince Turki Al Faisal. Great to have you with us. My job is not to introduce the speaker. My job is to introduce my good friend, Kevin Rudd. Kevin is a trustee of the Asia Society as well as the president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. And he will not say this because that's not the purpose of the event, but suffice to say that in the last 3-4 years, under his leadership, ASPI has become one of the truly significant think tanks in the United States and in the world. And it's not just because Kevin speaks good Chinese. I must say that of all the foreigners I know, Kevin's Chinese is by far the best. You hear about the former U.S. ambassador to China, you know, my other friend, Huntsman. When he speaks Mandarin, I have to really listen to understand. But when Kevin speaks, no need, he's the best. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, can I now welcome Kevin on stage to introduce the other panelists?
Thank you, Ronnie. It's always good to be back here in Hong Kong. Particularly here in Ronnie's living room, here at the Asia Society. It's a truly beautiful place, and Ronnie, wherever you're seated over here, it's a continuing tribute to your contribution, not just to Hong Kong, but to the global work of the Asia Society. So thank you, mate. It's the highest Australian accolade to refer to someone as mate. The Hong Kong brings back many memories for Therese, my wife, and I. We lived here in 1984. I was a student then at Chinese University of Hong Kong out at Shatin. And our middle... Our daughter came here with us as a 3-week-old baby. and our middle son, Nicholas, was born up on the hill here at the Matilda. And so he still has his Hong Kong birth certificate. He will seek subsequent citizenship application to the People's Republic in due course. Our purpose today, however, is not about Hong Kong. It's not even directly about China, though it is in part. It's about the future of the nuclear program on the Korean Peninsula and where that takes peace and security more broadly in the region and the world. Let me say one or two things as I prepare to invite our two guests to the stage. Let's stand back for a moment and reflect on just how rapidly things have moved in 3 months. Or, underneath the surface, how they may not have moved much at all, despite all the appearance of activity. 3 months ago, a little longer, the 28th of November, a date which is probably not first and foremost in people's mind, but it was the date on which the North Koreans tested their ICBM successfully, the Hwasong. They, at that stage, proclaimed the successful completion of their nuclear project. Come the 1st of December, 1st of January this year, in his New Year's address, Kim Jong-un then proclaimed that he was interested in the opening of a new inter-Korean dialogue and would wish for North Korean joint participation in the Winter Olympics to be held in South Korea. In the period since then, of course, we have seen the formation of a joint North Korean-South Korean team at the Winter Olympics. None of us can forget the North Korean cheerleading squad in their marvellous retro socialist realist form, a combination of karaoke, a combination of K-pop with Korean communist characteristics. It's a unique art form. Seriously weird. And then, since then, and the arrival of Kim Jong-un's sister to the Winter Olympics in the company of the nonagenarian Kim Yong-sam, and we've seen a flurry of inter-Korean activity leading to the visit to Pyongyang by the South Korean National Security Advisor Chung, a very lively dinner that evening hosted by Kim Jong-un. If Kim Jong-il had hosted it, it would have been less lively. And following that, a return to Seoul by National Security Advisor Chung, and immediately travelling on to Washington to brief the Trump administration of the outcome, including in National Security Advisor Chung's rendition of the conversation in Pyongyang, an invitation to the United States for there to be a bilateral summit between the North Korean leader and President Trump. I think what surprised the entire world, including the South Korean National Security Advisor Chung, was President Trump's immediate decision to say yes. And then we saw a further flurry of activity. This caught the South Koreans by surprise. It certainly caught the North Koreans by surprise. It caught the Chinese by surprise. It caught the rest of the US administration by surprise. And it caught me by surprise as well, the last in that long queue. And then the debate has gone on to focus as to would this summit actually proceed, would there be preconditions associated to the notion of denuclearization, and when would it proceed and where would it proceed. I think it's fair to say our Chinese friends were not entirely amused by this being unilaterally announced without prior consultation with them. And certainly in our own private discussions with the Chinese government, it's been plain that there has been somewhat of a breakdown in Chinese-American diplomatic communication over that particular event. In the meantime, we've seen the events of just the last few days. I have just come from Beijing, attending the China Development Forum, where I was speaking on the Belt and Road Initiative, among other things, including the current status of US-China trade relations. Perhaps the first sign that something unusual is happening in Beijing when all of us who were delegates to the China Development Forum at the Diaoyutai State Guest House got kicked out at 3 p.m. on Monday afternoon. This was not consistent with normal, polite Chinese practice. None of us, however, concluded that there was a more important guest about to arrive by train. And of course, by the time we got to that evening on Monday night, I was actually doing an interview with CNN on Monday night with Christiane Amanpour and Deputy National Security Advisor, formerly, Jeffrey from the United States. And when the rumours were flowing hard and fast in Beijing that something unusual was happening with an unexpected guest arriving by train, that tends to reduce the possibilities down a little. It was unlikely to be Vladimir Putin. It was likely to be someone closer at hand. And so you've seen this morning the confirmation finally through the Chinese official media that this indeed was a visit by Kim Jong-un, his first meeting with Xi Jinping, and his first visit to the People's Republic since becoming the General Secretary of the Korean Workers' Party 5 years ago. In fact, his first visit outside the borders of the DPRK in 5 years, since taking office. And this brings us to this morning. I'm glad China and the Foreign Ministry acceded to my request to postpone the confirmation of Kim Jong-un's visit until this morning, just to set the stage for our gathering here in Hong Kong at lunchtime today. That was a joke, in case anyone doesn't understand irony. But it does set the stage for where we are. And as I go on to introduce our two guests, let me just quote to you from the joint statement, or shall I say Xinhua account, of the comments made by Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping at the welcoming banquet at the Great Hall of the People for the visiting North Korean delegation. Comrade Xi Jinping said that we speak highly of this visit. He said both Comrade Chairman Kim Jong-un and I have personally experienced and witnessed the development of the China-DPRK relationship, adding that both sides have stated repeatedly that traditional Chinese-DPRK friendship should be passed on continuously and developed better. That leaves to one side what's happened for the last 5 years when there hasn't been so much continuity. In fact, a war of words between the two of them. Xi Jinping continues, "This is a strategic choice and the only right choice both sides have made based on history and reality, the international and regional structure, and the general situation of China-DPRK ties. This should not and will not change because of any singular particular event at any particular time," unquote. I think that's Xi Jinping being quite plain about the fact of let's let bygones be bygones and get on with the future. Kim Jong-il's response, not Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's response was equally interesting. Kim said, Comrade Xi Jinping enjoyed the support of the Chinese Communist Party and people of the whole country. He's become the core of the leadership and was re-elected Chinese President and Central Military Commission Chairman. Kim Jong-un said it is his obligation personally to come to congratulate Xi Jinping in person, in line with the friendly tradition of DPRK-China relations. He went on to say, at present the Korean Peninsula situation is developing rapidly and important changes have taken place. He's given to understatement, Kim Jong-un, adding that he felt he should come in time to inform Comrade General Secretary Xi Jinping personally of the situation out of comradeship and moral responsibility. So there are the formal statements from both sides. We'll now discuss what all that actually means, beyond, let's call it, the particular formalities of socialist realist language engaged in by both sides on an interesting formal occasion, such as that which has just been held in the Great Hall of the People. I can think of two no better discussants for this, and two better contributors, and two better panellists, and two better experts than our friend, our dear friend and colleague, the former Foreign Minister of the Republic of Korea, Yoon Byung-se, and the former Assistant Secretary of State of the US, Danny Russel. Former Foreign Minister Yoon has been an extraordinary contributor to the diplomacy of the ROK over 40 years. Professional diplomat, served in most significant capitals of the world, and has previously served as Deputy National Security Advisor to the President of the ROK, Senior Coordinator of the National Security Council of the ROK, and has served for 4.5 years as Foreign Minister of the ROK until the recent change in government in Seoul. He is South Korea's second longest serving Foreign Minister, and a person who has been upfront, close and personal with all the ebbs and flows of the North Korean question, relationship, including the nuclear dimension, over many, many years. So we're very grateful to have you with us today, Byung-se. You are a welcome guest with us. Joining him, of course, is Danny Russel, who has been our diplomat in residence at the Asia Society Policy Institute for the last 12 months. Danny also is an extraordinarily experienced American career diplomat, served in the region and has also served in the White House, and in that capacity served as Special Assistant to President Obama and the National Security Council's Senior Director for Asian Affairs, and most recently as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia in the State Department. Therefore, with core line responsibility for the Korean question, the North Korean nuclear program included. So I can think of two no better persons to be with us. So ladies and gentlemen, could you please welcome these two individuals as they come to the stage. So thank you very much. I gather you two, by the way, began your personal/professional relationship when you were both assigned to your respective national missions to the UN. Did you drink a lot in those days?
We worked a lot in those days. The difference is that Foreign Minister Yoon kept working and I started drinking.
Okay. That's when Danny started hanging out with the Australian mission instead. But give us a word or two about what you two worked on in those days, because I think it's of significance in terms of our discussion today.
But actually, at the time, South Korea was not a member of the United Nations, despite we joined despite the fact that we became the independent country in 1948. So our main task is how to achieve this simultaneous mission of two Koreas, South and North Korea. At the time, Danny was great, very much contributed to this historical achievements. So since that time, we have worked on these important issues together for the last 20-something years. So that goes on.
I should add there was another brilliant diplomat serving at the UN at that time, and her name is Ambassador Chan Heng-chi, who was the permanent representative of Singapore.
And Heng-chi, were these two guys well behaved when you were there? You asked the Singaporeans, I'll give you a very candid answer, and Heng-chi's response was, Danny was well behaved, he doesn't know about you. It's okay. Let's talk about the subject at hand. And that's how do we make sense of this extraordinary cacophony of events over the last 3 months? Let me start with Danny, because you've been dealing from a US perspective with the peninsula for such a long period of time. How do we best historically frame what's unfolded since the events of the 28th of November?
Well, Kevin, you correctly pointed out a series of surprise moves by the North Koreans and by others. But there's an important distinction to be made, I think, between strategic surprise and tactical surprise. So, if anyone who's been to Macau knows that the house is going to win. So if you take your life savings to the gaming tables, sooner or later they'll be reduced. That's not a surprise. That's a strategic inevitability. The tactical surprise may be losing all your money on the first roll of the roulette wheel. So in a similar vein, while there is a tactical surprise to the abrupt and dramatic timing of some of North Korea's moves, certainly the spate of missile launches and the thermonuclear test, the abrupt pivot on January 1st to a peace offensive. On a strategic level, it's really not a surprise because this is replicating a pattern that we've seen again and again. Basically, North Korea has two speeds. It cycles or toggles between them. One is raising tensions. The other is raising expectations. North Korea will scare the world and then dangle some hint of maybe an opportunity to de-escalate and to try to parlay that de-escalation, that reduction of tensions, leverage it into some sort of benefit, usually testing or actually extracting concessions. And when they satisfy themselves that the world isn't going to pay them any more just to back away from threats, well, then they revert to the first escalatory cycle. So it's an ongoing alternation between the tensions on the one hand and the hopes on the other. That's kind of their business model. I think for our part in dealing with North Korea, the challenge is and remains not to get trapped in that cycle, not to get so frightened or intimidated on the upswing, or so relieved on the downswing that we lose sight of what our real interests are and what our real objectives are. And in terms of our own cycle, on one side of the equation is cynicism. It's easy to be skeptical and suspicious of an authoritarian state like North Korea that has a troubled relationship with the truth. On the other hand is naivete. So we neither want to be so cynical in dealing with North Korea that we miss what could prove to be an opportunity to get some kind of peaceful negotiating process underway, nor do we want to be so naive that we simply fall into the kinds of traps that are written out pretty clearly in the Kim family playbook.
That's a very useful, sobering framing of the discussion. I liked your use of the word toggling, because move it one way, move it the other. These are tactical moves within a strategic frame, and the strategic frame being no substantive movement at all on the question of the irremovability of the North Korean nuclear capability, but tempered with, as you rightly said, those of us who watch these things for so long perhaps become blinded to whether there is the possibility of some shift which we don't quite see. Very good framing.
I would add, Kevin, that in the seminal New Year's Day statement that you referenced, which is among the cognoscenti at least known as the big button speech. That's the speech in which Kim Jong-un made the point that he's got a big nuclear button right on his desk, and he knows how to use it. That got the attention.
Someone else said they had a bigger button.
So I'm told.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about that speech is that it represents two sides of the equation. On the one hand, in this speech, Kim Jong-un says, this is our nuclear shield and sword. It will never be removed. No power on earth can take away our nuclear capability. In the same speech, he talks not only about the importance of reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula and the prospect of a joint Olympic team, but at length about the North Korean economy. And these are the two sides of the equation. Kim Jong-un's strategy is to have his cake and eat it too, to retain the illegally acquired nuclear and ballistic missile weapon capability that he developed in defiance of UN Security Council resolutions, and also to extract economic assistance, sanctions relief, and the benefits of legitimate membership in the international community. He wants both. The challenge for the rest of the world is whether we can design a dynamic in which one is traded for the other, namely that North Korea can obtain the security and the economic benefits that it seeks in exchange for peacefully relinquishing its nuclear and missile program.
So let's freeze that thought for when we come back to our open dialogue in a minute after I've asked Byung-se for his opening remarks. But the key question is, in my mind, as someone who studies Beijing, is what will the Chinese be prepared to allow him to get away with? Having his cake and eating it too, or just having his cake? Let's come back to that, because I think that's a key question. Byung-se, your initial reflections on where we've got to as someone who's been in the hot seat and knows better than any of us the reality being faced now by South Korean negotiators and the folks that you have on the other side of the table.
Thank you, Kevin, for your kind remarks at the outset, and also thank you for President Shiran and members of the Asia Society for giving me this great opportunity. I think this meeting, this forum is very timely for reasons we know very well. And this surprising visit by a young leader of North Korea drawing our attention. Actually, as Kevin covered very succinctly, since August last year until at least the late last year, we have been talking about war clouds. Some people in the United States talked about 15 to 50% of the chances of war on the Korean Peninsula. And you know, there are the famous talks about fire and fury, total destruction, and many other things coming from President Trump. And in the same way, North Korea has never stopped making very harsh statements. But suddenly, since New Year's message early this year, we are witnessing totally different developments. Now, as Kevin very succinctly summarized, we are hearing a proliferation of summits. For example, in the forthcoming 2 months, we are supposed to have at least 5 summits. Later next month, we are supposed to have Inter-Korean Summit. Then maybe sometime in May, U.S.-North Korea Summit. In between, probably South Korea-U.S. Summit. And before the U.S.-DPRK Summit, probably South Korea, Japan, and China Summit. And even now, there are talks about the possibility of having trilateral summit among South Korea, U.S., and North Korea. Then early this week, we had another element, that is North Korea-China summit. So this represents this multi-factor equation character of this North Korean conundrum. Actually, why? What led to this interesting development? What's the reason behind this? For North Korea, for Kim Jong-un, I think this reflects both desperation and his own confidence. Desperation, I mean that for the last 2 years, international community has been successful in mobilizing the very strong consensus to sanction North Korea's the bad behavior. So we adopted a lot of resolutions. That is that has been the strongest ever, unprecedented the sanctions, and that hurts North Korea severely. Many experts were talking about have said that North Korea may not survive for another year due to these severe sanctions. Another reason, maybe more important reason, seems to be that this North Korean leader must have been very concerned about the possibility of U.S. military strike, and the well-known bloody nose operation or bloody nose strategy seems to have made a kind of very important impact on the mindset of the North Korean government. But on the other hand, this represents kind of confidence on his part. As Kevin and Danny has explained very well, since he made a successful test of ICBM Hwasong 15, he already he may have anticipated this kind of a new kind of roadmap starting from New Year's message, because in that message he already contained very important elements. That is, grand proposal for improving inter-Korea relations. So on the basis of that roadmap, what we see the lately ongoing developments. And this also enhances his image and the stature. The picture, we have to simply imagine the picture to be taken at the summit involving President Trump and also Mr. Kim Jong-un. That simple picture or footage will be sufficient enough to show his people that Kim Jong-un is now an international leader as a normal state, not a rogue state. So this is very interesting development. But anyhow, now we know how this decision has been made, roughly, but the die has been cast. This is the time for our real actors to engage in very serious preparations. But still, there are both negative and positive, expectation. Positive hopes, expectations, and hopes are that probably there could be a peace momentum that will continue. Probably there will be more exchange of dialogue, people between South and North Korea. At least many people in Korea, South Korea, are relieved to see the easing of tensions. But on the other hand, there has been a growing concern, not just in South Korea and the United States, because, as Kevin rightly said, this is only a facade. Optics-wise, it's very good, but there has been no evidence that North Korea has really changed its game plan. Rather, we have to ask ourselves several key questions first. One small question has been answered yesterday through this statement in Beijing. At least he confirmed the indirect message he sent through South Korean space envoy. This is the will of his father and grandfather. And then he is committed to denuclearization. But another big question we have to ask is whether this represents a strategic decision or choice, as mentioned by Kevin at the outset, or tactical decision, or in a opposite way, another kind of disguised peace offensive. They are very used to this. We have to see. This could go in either way. So on my part, I wish to emphasize two big aspects in approaching this summit, especially U.S.-North Korea summit, because for the inter-Korean talks, I guess that will be I think that both sides will be very much satisfied with the outcome, even though this time South Korean government plans to raise this nuclear issue more intensively. before, actually there was no real opportunity for South Korean government to raise this issue. So the key question is, the denuclearization issue should be at the forefront of any discussion during the inter-Korean talks and U.S.-North Korea talks. And the key point is that actually, but very famous language, CVID, complete, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement of North Korean nuclear weapons. Now, North Korea is now talking about preconditions. For them, denuclearization means not just denuclearization of North Korea. It applies to entire Korean Peninsula, even the region as a whole, even for the world as well. But when they announced a very important proposal 2 years ago, they listed 5 preconditions for denuclearization. Most of them are non-starters to the United States, including the withdrawal of the United States forces in Korea. There has been no evidence that they have changed this position. And now, according to this Shinhwa-net statement, now they tend to characterize the forthcoming talks as peace talks, not as denuclearization talks. So the key question, another key question we have to ask ourselves is that we have to learn a lesson from the past. That means we failed already 4 times in the past because verification was not that comprehensive, was not very thorough. So our catchy phrase should be distrust, therefore verify. Otherwise, there will be many loopholes to take place, even though we are going to have a very good outcome. But until everything is finished, nothing is finished. And John F. Kennedy said, let's not be afraid of the negotiation out of fear. Let's fear not to negotiate. So this time we have to prepare for this summit with all the expertise and wisdom. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you for that introduction as well, and the background that you have brought to bear on the essential question of denuclearization and its verification. What I'm proposing to do in the next 15 and 20 minutes is to run through 6 or 7 questions, 4 or 5. And I thought the best way to do this was perhaps let's go to each element of the strategic equation. That is the bottom line, as we see it, going into this period ahead in Pyongyang, what we think their strategy is, what their tactics are, what they think they can get away with. I'm then going to go on to the question of what's the perspective from Seoul right now on the same questions. What do they believe is achievable out of this round of diplomacy? And then on to Beijing and the US. And let's see where we wind up by about that time. And to put both of you on some notice, if you're in the positions of responsibility now against the denuclearization option, what would you do, given the realities we face? So let's just start, and I know we've talked a lot already about what the DPRK strategy and tactics are, but if I could just focus you, Danny, on the 2 relevant phrases in the Xinhua summary coming out of Beijing this morning, where Kim Jong-un is quoted as saying, "It is our consistent stand to be committed to denuclearization on the peninsula in accordance with the will of the late President Kim Il-sung and the late General Secretary Kim Jong-il," he said. Then he goes on to say, "The issue of denuclearization of the Korean peninsula can be resolved, comma, if," underline, my underlining, not his, "South Korea and the United States respond to our efforts with goodwill, if they create an atmosphere of peace and stability, then third, while taking progressive and synchronous measures for the realization of peace," unquote. Now, is all that just diplomatic gobbledygook, or does it actually mean something? Danny, over to you, and then I'll flip to you again, if that's okay, Foreign Minister.
Well, the words, Kevin, sometimes change in the North Korean lexicon, but what doesn't change is the vagueness and the elasticity of the thresholds, the hurdles that they set out. So typically the North Koreans, who, by the way, have asked, as far as I know, every president of the United States, certainly since Bill Clinton, for a direct leaders summit, have always said that the United States needs to show sincerity, end its hostile policy, create a positive and peaceful atmosphere, take proactive or constructive measures. But they get to define when enough is enough and what that means. Typically, in practice, in the course of actual negotiations, hostile policies, which are not explicitly mentioned, at least by Xinhua, but are very much at the heart of the North Korean message, means the presence on South Korean soil of U.S. forces. It means the existence of a U.S. ROK defense alliance. It means the U.S. forces' presence on Japan and the alliance collaboration with Australia. And it also means you looked at me funny. And in doing so, the United States, according to North Korea, has violated the terms of any agreement and has justified its own extraordinary measures, and those often are simply welching on a deal, cheating on an agreement. It's a misnomer to think that North Korea refuses to negotiate. North Korea is perfectly happy to negotiate. They will only negotiate, however, the things they want. They won't negotiate on the things that they don't want. So they'd be happy to negotiate the withdrawal of U.S. forces and the capitulation of the Republic of Korea. They've said again and again, notwithstanding denuclearization being the long-held, cherished dream of Kim Il-sung, that there is no force on earth that will cause North Korea to relinquish its sacred sword and shield, its nuclear weapons. And in a Leninist system, when two utterly contradictory principles coexist, it's the leader who gets to decide which one ultimately matters.
That doesn't sound entirely encouraging. Foreign Minister, the baseline from Pyongyang, what do they think they can get out of this period of diplomacy?
Well, before I directly respond to that, I think Kim Jong-un's game plan seems to be to kill 5 or 6 birds with one stone. In Korea, there is a saying, kill 2 birds with one stone. They want to kill the 5 birds at least, South Korea, the US, now China, maybe Japan, and many others. Maybe Australia, I think. I think they chose very weak link in this multilateral regional equation, starting from South Korea. And then that impacted the President Trump's decision. But on China, Kim Jong-un seems to be taking a page out of his father's playbook in 2000. In 2000, in May, before the Kim Jong-il had planned the inter-Korean summit, he suddenly made a visit to Beijing. I think this seems to be the ongoing development seems to be very similar to the previous development. And then regarding this Kevin's question, actually for the last 20-something years, who moves first has been the key question in this, especially since the inauguration of President Trump's. Actually, the U.S. government wants North Korea to move first. But if you read this statement by Shinha Net, the same thing stays here. North Korea wants the United States to move first. In this statement, at least 3 conditions, 3 ifs. If you read the statement made by South Korean Space Envoy to Pyongyang, there are 2 big preconditions. First big precondition is U.S. should eliminate military threat to North Korea. That's big precondition. Another big precondition is that U.S. should provide security assurance or regime stability assurance to North Korea. But that is equivalent to 5 preconditions for denuclearization I have mentioned already. To move first with this peaceful gesture North Korea wants. That seems to be very difficult for us to imagine. And basically, their bottom line, or maybe opening position seems to be to get a relief from international sanctions, because it's very tough. Except oil, everything is now prohibited. But at the end of the road, they will demand the peace treaty or peace agreement with the United States. Already, as I said at the outset, they characterize these forthcoming talks as peace talks, especially since 2015. They are working very hard on this peace talks issue behind the scenes, making some suggestions to the American colleagues at the track 1.5 or track 2 meetings. So together with this Chinese proposal for parallel negotiation, denuclearization negotiation, and peace talk negotiation, I guess that they had a discussion on this matter as well, this time, early this week. So you have to be very careful and cautious about this, because intrinsically, peace talks was not integral part of this denuclearization discussion. It was a separate discussion, separate track. But now, North Korea and China seems to be trying to integrate this separate issue as a part of this integral nuclear problems. So bottom line seems to be that they want the bottom line to at least both sides should move simultaneously. That impression, that stance was reflected in this synchronized step. I think that is the intention of North Korea, I guess.
This I moved now to the question of how it's seen from Seoul and how Seoul will play this. I mean, I've been to North Korea a couple of times, and I've escaped on both occasions. But I've always found our North Korean friends to be just brutally pragmatic about everything. And when they approach this, pardon me if I'm wrong, but I get the impression that their absolute de minima expectation and hope is we simply kick the can down the road for another year or so and take the pressure off the looming, shall I say, military atmosphere in Washington, as they would describe it, even though it may not be a majority view within the administration, about the wisdom or otherwise of a bloody-nosed strike. And that if there's a second sort of baseline North Korean interest is just maybe if we shake this tree hard enough, with enough diplomacy, we may get some partial relief on sanctions. And thirdly, if something else mysteriously appears, well, let's evaluate that when the time comes. But I tend to agree with my two colleagues here that they're closer to this than I am, that we all have very minimalist expectations in terms of what the North Koreans see as being doable. So let's flip to the other side of the parallel. We're in your hometown, Seoul. Is your hometown Seoul?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Not everyone from Korea is from Seoul. I just thought I should ask. Many other beautiful places in Korea apart from Seoul. But if you're in the position in the Blue House right now, and I'll flip to you first, Foreign Minister, on this question, and you're dealing with these realities, what is the South Korean bottom line here? What do you hope to get out of this? Institutionally, your system knows what the North Koreans are like. You've seen 4 times all this happen before in cycles of toggle forward and toggle backwards. President Moon's riding high, I think, in the domestic opinion polls. Even his and National Security Advisor Chung's expectations were exceeded, some would say frighteningly so, when he went to Washington. And President Trump said, yes, I'll see the guy anytime he wants. Rocket Man meets Rocket Man. If you were now in the Blue House, what would be your advice?
Well, I fully understand the dilemma faced by my South Korean government, my colleagues at the Blue House as well. Actually, President Moon once said some months ago that this is the biggest security threat challenge in Korean history since 1940, since the end of the Korean War. But now he calls this ongoing development a miraculous opportunity through which we can achieve peace, permanent peace, and resolve many things at once and once and for all. But he also likens this current situation to walking on a very fragile glass. For me, I wish to liken that to walking over minefields. There are so many mines in this field. So for now, the South Korean government is now intensively engaged in what they call brokering diplomacy. Even though we are allies, in alliance relations with Washington, this time South Korean government seems to be make every effort to maintain this current peace momentum. The problem is, this time, unlike the previous two summits, unless we raise this nuclear issue very seriously as an agenda, then there will be no meaningful progress in the following talks, especially U.S.-North Korea talks. So this is the dilemma. If South Korean government push ahead with these nuclear issues very, very, very heavily, then North Korea leader may not be happy because at least these preconditions should be met by Washington first. So how to reconcile, how to strike a fine balance between these widening differences in Washington and Pyongyang, that is the key challenge faced by the Blue House and the South Korean government. But nevertheless, I really wish that they could exercise their diplomatic skills to make some kind of breakthrough or at least progress in these important, daunting challenges.
Danny, the bottom line from Seoul, how do you read it?
Well, Kevin, I think the greatest strategic asset that any of the five parties around North Korea have, certainly the U.S., South Korea, Japan, and China, is unity. And to the extent that we are unified together, cooperating, communicating effectively, we present a united front and a powerful force of pressure towards the DPRK, and we can get them to do things that they don't want to do, which is not an easy proposition. Conversely, North Korea's game is divide and conquer. And Foreign Minister Yoon used the phrase weakest link in the chain. It was clear that Kim Jong-un saw the priority that the South Korean government places on having a secure and a successful Olympic as an opening, as an opportunity, and I think he made use of it. For the North Koreans to sow divisions between Washington and Seoul, Tokyo and Beijing is to gain desperately needed breathing space. And I think from I think for each of the parties, obviously the greatest nightmare is a nuclear war, but the second, everybody's second worst nightmare is that the other guy has a direct dialogue and makes a separate deal with North Korea, leaving you and your own national interests out in the cold. It was clear, I'm sure you'll get to China, but it was clear from the Chinese reaction to the announcement on the steps of the White House about a Trump-Kim summit that they were, shall we say, conflicted about that. So I think from the perspective of any of the allied capitals, but from Beijing as well, the risk that one party is going to move independently and without due regard for the collective interests is a very serious concern.
Byung-se?
Actually, Danny mentioned the importance of unity between the two allies and also among five parties. Actually, if we read the Korean newspapers this morning, some conservative newspapers they emphasize the need for China to stick to the implementation of their sanctions measures, because for the last 2 years, China played a very important role in making or forcing North Korea to come this far. So if they change their stance and they eased sanctions on North Korea, then that could be the starting point for easing of, or maybe the weakening of the international sanctions regime. So we have to, the key principle we have to maintain is to stick to the sanctions, maintain the sanctions to the end of the vision we have, the objective we have, that is final dismantlement of North Korean nuclear weapons. As you know already, I'll not give my estimate on how many nuclear weapons they have, but already experts like Dr. Hacker or Dr. Albright are saying that they have nuclear weapons between 15 and 35, between 20 and 40. Even Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States, according to leaked documents, they are talking about the 60 nuclear weapons. That is almost half of a South Asian country. So North Korea has been benchmarking that South Asian country, and that is more than enough, their second strike capability. We are already within the range of South Korea and Japan are already within the range of their nuclear missiles, but now it can reach not just Seoul and Tokyo, but also Guam and Hawaii and Washington DC already, due to this successful launch of Hwasong 15 late November last year. And as NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg as mentioned 2 months ago, now Pyongyang is much closer to Munich than to Washington DC. So Munich, Singapore, even Canberra could be targets of these North Korean nuclear weapons.
The sobering remarks indeed. As we move the geographical dial towards Beijing, when I was last in Seoul in December, I went and saw National Security Advisor Chung in the Blue House, and we spent quite a bit of time about what was then the impending visit to Beijing by President Moon. When we look at Chinese diplomacy right now and what has just been pulled off with the visit to Beijing by Kim Jong-un, it raises the question you've just touched on about where does Chinese strategy and tactics go to from here? Does it mean that China's substantive policy remains denuclearization of the peninsula, as is reflected in the early statements this morning from Xi Jinping? Or is there something less than that than our Chinese friends are willing to tolerate in terms of an outcome? So let's reflect on strategy and tactics from Beijing's perspective. I'll add one thought and then flip it to Danny and then back to you, Foreign Minister. On the tactics, I think the Chinese play in the last 48 hours has been quite brilliant. China was left out in the cold by the unilateral decision by President Trump to agree to an oral request for a summit with Kim Jong-un and made that agreement without any preconditions. And as we discover, without consultation with anybody much. So this did not amuse Beijing. I've had that confirmed at multiple levels in multiple places. And if there is one thing that people don't want to have happen to them, it's to be excluded from the table. And so China, over the intervening few weeks, has been hard at work. The precise mechanics we're unfamiliar with. But the result we now see in terms of the events of the last couple of days, when for the first time in 5 years and the first time in his term in office, Kim Jong-un travels to Beijing. So at de minima, on the question of tactics, China is saying to the United States and the rest of the world, anyone wants a deal on anything on the future of the Korean Peninsula, and certainly something which deals with nukes, don't think you can walk around us, guys. Has everyone got that message? That's kind of the bottom line here. And I think that's been delivered eloquently. That is a question of tactics. But on strategy, as well as tactics, Danny, over to you. You've been dealing with our Chinese friends on Korea for longer than me. And then to you, Foreign Minister.
Well, China has eminently legitimate interests on the Korean Peninsula, and those interests deserve to be factored into the equation as American or South Korean or Japanese policymakers examine their own options. Without a doubt, the reaction in Zhongnanhai to the abrupt news that President Trump had announced his intent to hold a summit was a mix of relief that we were looking at a summit instead of a bloody nose, but horror and concern at the lack of coordination and the risk that China and its interests would be somehow marginalized or sidelined. But there is no peaceful solution to the threat posed by North Korea that doesn't involve real U.S.-China cooperation. The failure of the U.S. to consult with China or other partners in advance of an announcement of a decision to hold a summit, the failure of China to do likewise, doesn't augur well for our ability to push and nudge and pressure North Korea towards the kind of complete and verifiable denuclearization that we are both aiming for. We really need to present a unified front, and what we should worry about at this juncture is a recurrence of the bad model of 3 against 3, where China and Russia line up behind North Korea in opposition to the US, the ROK, and Japan. That's not a recipe for stability in Northeast Asia.
Young-se, China, bottom
Yes.
lines.
Yes. Actually, this is related to how China sees North Korea. Whether North Korea will be a strategic asset or strategic liability. They are saying that their position is threefold, as was mentioned in this Shinhan statement. They are now more than ever tending to emphasize the need for denuclearization, because any nuclear test in North Korea will affect northeastern China as well. But they are still very cautious about pushing North Korea too far, because if that becomes the case, that could lead to the collapse of the North Korean regime. So still, I think they will not press North Korea to that point. But our concern is that unless we are united, as Danny mentioned, among 5 parties, to press North Korea to feel the pains emanating from their illegal possession of nuclear weapons, North Korea has no incentive to give up nuclear weapons. So this is why the role of China is very, very important. At this point, they should continue to play a constructive role with the US, with South Korea. Otherwise, this Northeast Asia will start unwanted, unfortunate development, that is nuclear arms race involving new actors, even some nuclear rearmament. As you know already, some countries have a big potential for that. And very famous American scholar are now saying that we are starting new post-Cold War, a second nuclear age in the post-Cold War era. That means already we have 2 de facto nuclear weapon states, 1 nuclear weapon state, maybe 1 country, North Korea, who is aiming at another nuclear weapon state. Then if this ignites nuclear arms race, there'll be 1 or 2 more. So I think we have to prevent this from becoming a reality. So this is the importance of these ongoing talks.
I think my managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, Deborah Eisenman, is giving me dirty looks now for 15 minutes because I was supposed to turn to Q&A 15 minutes ago, but I haven't because I wanted to provide people the opportunity to hear from our two guests. So I'm looking at you, Josette. Can we go through to 225 rather than 215 or not? Josette's looking zen. Deborah is not zen. As we quickly flip then to the United States, that'll leave time for 2 or 3 questions from the audience. I have this concern, I suppose, or reflection that the bottom line Chinese position on North Korea may be, if a deal on denuclearization occurs, it would be some sort of arrangement which saw a freeze imposed on the further development of North Korea's ICBM intercontinental ballistic missile capability, that is, that which threatens the United States mainland, while effectively accepting the continued reality of North Korean short to medium range missiles and the nuclear capabilities which go along with that. From a Chinese perspective, that would not be ideal. It still runs the risk of proliferation consequences in South Korea and with Japan as they would seek to respond to that threat. But it would also create enormous tensions between the Republic of Korea and the United States on the one hand, and between Japan and the United States on the other. But I'll just leave that parked there as a thought. Finally, before we just go to a brief period of Q&A, the United States of America, Uncle Sam. So you're sitting in the White House, Danny Russel, where you've sat for some time in the West Wing, and you've now seen the Chinese diplomatic play over the weekend with Kim Jong-un taking a long train ride to Beijing, with food tasters intact in both directions. How do you think the United States could and should play this negotiation now?
Well, Kevin, I think sanctions are a little bit like penicillin, and it is dangerous to end the regimen prematurely because the problem just comes roaring back in exacerbated form. So one thing that is very important, as Foreign Minister Yoon stressed, is the importance of maintaining the positive pressure of withholding and denying North Korea the rewards for its bad behavior and the wherewithal to fund continued confrontation and so on. But at the same time, we can't be blind to the possibility that the pressure of sanctions, particularly those applied by China, have brought Kim Jong-un to a point where he feels forced to consider options that he had consistently rejected thus far. So setting the stage for serious diplomatic negotiation, a real process, is the challenge that lies before us. No president in the United States thus far had considered it prudent to begin a process with the DPRK at leader level. It really doesn't leave you very many places to go except down if it doesn't work. I think were there to be a successful summit, quote unquote successful, it's likely to be one that brought us back in effect to square one, where the experts and the negotiators were empowered to sit down with the DPRK counterparts and hopefully in consultation with partners in South Korea and China to begin the difficult effort that has been attempted now, as Foreign Minister Yoon said, 4 times, to navigate a series of trade-offs and gives and takes that gradually move the DPRK from a freeze to a monitored freeze to a rollback to ultimately a dismantlement of its nuclear and missile program.
Foreign Minister, if I could hear your thoughts briefly before I turn to the audience.
Right. Actually, when I read this Shinranet statement, one thing draws my attention. That is, for the first time in recent 2 weeks, Kim Jong-un, with his own voice, confirmed the fact that he and his regime is now ready to engage in summit talks with the United States. That's the first time. Because so far there was a silence on this matter, so that's good. And regarding U.S. position, I really wish President Trump to maintain his principled position. That is, he will be different from previous American leaders. He will redress the defects and problems they suffered in the past. So for that to happen, he should not be tempted to have a political trophy, because this year there will be a by-election in the United States. In Korea, we have a provincial election in June. So we have to focus on this matter as a merit, not for political scoring, point scoring. So otherwise, as Kevin said, in case he agrees on some half-baked measure like decoupling, having assurance from Kim Jong-un on the suspension of ICBM launch, for the development of ICBM launch, instead of maintaining this capability for nuclear short-range and medium-range missiles, intermediate-range missiles, then that will be the nightmarish scenario for Seoul and Tokyo. And freeze-based approach is not the answer. That's the objective is the CVID, and moratorium is not sufficient. That can be done anytime, a very easy one. So we should not forget the previous lessons.
We've got time for 2 quick questions. Who is busting to ask a question? Prince Turki Al Faisal, you're very quick. So this is going to be a zinger of a question, which you've been working on for the last hour. Your Royal Highness.
What about Russia? Russia is also a player in this, and they have problems with the West now. Could they be going to use this as one way of gaining something from it?
I might turn to you, Foreign Minister, to answer that.
Well, for many years in the past, there has been a very nice division of labor between Moscow and Beijing. On the Middle East issues, it will be Russia who will take the initiative. Then China will support that stance. On this North Korea question, China has tended to take the initiative, and Moscow has been in support of Chinese stance. But these days, especially for the last 2 years, when China is more active on this implementation of the sanctions on North Korea was very unhappy and very infuriated. So they approached Russia more than ever before, and Russia now wants more voices in this North Korean question, and they are already ready to provide good advices to North Korea on how to deal with the United States. But our suggestion is that Russia's role is very important, not just as a veto, the potential as a member of the Security Council who can play a veto rights, but also because actually without help of all of our neighbors, actually this regional problem cannot be resolved once and for all.
Good. One question from down here. Anyone got the microphone over there? Good. Well done. Otherwise, they're going to throw you mine. Good.
Dick Drobnik, Southern California Center. Foreign Minister Yun, I confess I'm very skeptical that North Korea will give up nuclear weapons. Convince me that I'm wrong. What do they need, in your mind, to really give them up?
So far, I made some long explanation, especially I belong to the previous conservative government. The policy I have pursued is a very, very strong campaign to build an international the front to implement the sanctions on North Korea. Because without those sanctions, North Korea will not give up. But even with those strongest ever sanctions, we are very much we are not very much optimistic about the possibility that North Korea will give up nuclear weapons, because already this pursuit of nuclear weapons is enshrined in their constitution in 2012. Then the following year, they enacted a new separate law to justify that. Then in 2013, they started this new principle, new policy of pursuing parallel approach. That means nuclear weapons development as well as economic development. Now, this has been characterized by Kim Jong-un as the crowning achievements. So how can they abandon these nuclear weapons? So the reason why they offer freeze or the conditional denuclearization seems to be because they have no real intention to give up what they have already. Maybe if they can compromise in the coming weeks and months, if our American colleagues and others are very lucky, maybe their bottom line could be some kind of freeze or partial denuclearization. But South Korea and Japan and many others in the international community will not accept that partial deal.
Danny, the question wasn't to you, but you got 60 seconds. Is there any hope on heaven or in hell that the DPRK would give up its nuclear capability?
Not willingly, but we have to raise the cost to North Korea and to the regime in Pyongyang for possessing and for manufacturing, and certainly for proliferating nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. Raise the cost while also addressing what North Korea is using them for. North Korea is not in the nuclear warfighting business. Nuclear weapons are a means to an end. They're economic ends, they're political leverage over South Korea, form of extortion, to garner economic benefits, to garner status. Now, if you were to give all of that to North Korea up front, it would have its cake and eat it too. Instead, to set a dynamic whereby North Korea can only obtain the economic and the political benefits that it seeks by gradually coming into compliance. That's the strategy that we should pursue.
Well, today we've heard from Danny Russel, master of the toggle. Is this about full forward on escalation and now full reverse on de-escalation? A change in tactics, but not in strategy, but a maybe. Is there a glimmer of light that we've still yet to fully perceive? And the analogy is used by the foreign minister, where the mission now being one of walking on very thin glass, which he said was far too generous an analogy. It's picking your way through a minefield and walking on glass at the same time. Either way, it doesn't strike me as an easy way forward. Here's my concluding thought. What I worry about is where we get to if one round or the other round of summitry, the 5 that have been talked about, actually come to nothing. What I worry about is when Washington, under the current administration, concludes that, quote, we've tried diplomacy and it's failed, unquote, particularly if the diplomacy is ill-prepared, because in a very simplistic view of the world, that then leaves one option remaining, which has the word military attached to it. So with that sobering thought, let me ask all of you to put your hands together to thank this extraordinary panel for their contribution.
You know, Kevin, I'm a Hong Kong businessman. I'm standing here as nothing more than that. By definition, a businessman is not a diplomat, nor international affairs expert. By definition, also almost, a Hong Kong businessman means that he know nothing about international affairs. But I suspect that they do have a little bit of common sense, without which they would have been bankrupt long time ago. So allow me to just a commonsensical final comment. The Chinese, I cannot speak for them, of course. I don't know what they're thinking, but you know, those guys have been telling America to meet with this guy whether it's his grandfather, father, or now Kim Jong-un, have been telling the Americans to meet directly with them for a long time. And the North Korean leaders have always wanted to meet with the United States president without the Chinese. And so when they detonated the first nuclear device underground, they didn't even let the Chinese know. The Chinese got a phone call from Washington, D.C. and said, hey, Washington, D.C. says, what are you going to do? The Chinese say, do what? They didn't even know that that thing has happened. So, for China to be surprised should not be surprising. And if the Chinese are surprised, they're really not that smart. But that said, I don't know what they have to pay to get the guy to take a train ride. I find it very interesting what happened last night. So my commonsensical final thought is this. Finally, North Korea must think that they now have enough of a bomb and a delivery system that they can afford to talk peace. Without it, there's no peace possible. So now it's peace talk. Without it, they don't want to talk to the United States for the time being. And America has missed so many chances in the last 30, 40 years, perhaps as early as Carter, to deal with North Korea. And each time, by not talking to North Korea, it ratcheted the game in the wrong direction, and it gives time for North Korea to develop the bomb even more. And finally, perhaps they think that they got it, and now I'm happy. I can talk peace with you guys. Hey, listen, Trump, whether it's Trump or somebody else, finally agreed to meet with the North Korean leaders. That's what they have been asking for decades anyway, and that's what the Chinese have been advocating for decades. And so perhaps the thing is not what the experts like to think it is. And I agree with Dick Dropnik here. I just don't see why they should give up denuclearize when they just finished building the bomb. They don't do it in order to get rid of it tomorrow. And that is, as Daniel rightly say, it is really, just bargaining chip. And Gaddafi, if he had it, he may still be alive today. So I just don't see how those guys are going to get rid of it. And one of the experts in North America who spoke at the Asia Society in Hong Kong for several times said to me in my office a few months ago, and he testified in the U.S. Congress all the time, and he said, just treat that guy as having a bomb already. And of course, what else do you expect? And so, I just hope that Trump, as Kevin said at the very end, would not do a foolish thing. Now that you finally are forced to, it's not Trump's gift to North Korea. America has no choice but to talk to that guy now that he has a bomb. And so let's hope that Trump will not make a mess out of this whole thing, in which, if not, we are all sunk. As far as the five-party cooperation is concerned, China doesn't have the end game the same thing as the United States. So if you don't have the end game, you don't have anything in common. Well, I shouldn't say that. You have very little in common, and you really have to negotiate recognizing each other's end game. For example, China doesn't want North Korea to go. They don't want the United States to have a military there, be it south of the 38th parallel or north of it. So, if we don't have common sense and recognize the other guy's position, I think we'll be talking here next year, the year after next, and then 10 years later, we'll still be talking if we are alive. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's hope that the world will be a better place because of the wonderful talk that our experts have given us today. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our speakers.